So you're looking to purchase a rental property, or maybe you've even purchased one yourself. And even if you found a great real estate investment deal that's an asset now, it could easily turn into a liability if not managed correctly. So in today's video, I'm gonna be covering the top 9 tips to help you self-manage your rental properties, even if you have a full-time job. Property is one of the most important skills you can add to your toolbox, especially if you're planning on growing and building out your real estate empire. Now, thankfully, this skill here can be learned through education and experience. So in this video, I'm gonna be covering my top 9 tips I've learned so far to help you better manage your real estate properties. Because at the end of the day, you're buying these rental properties so you can achieve that financial freedom and that desired lifestyle sooner. And my guess is that desired lifestyle doesn't include dealing with tenants that are gonna give you a massive headache or having to fix a toilet at 1 a.m. So if you're new here, my name is Matthew. I'm a realtor in the GTA, and this is my channel where I share everything I've learned around real estate, finance, and personal development, helping empower you to make the best decisions possible. So if you're interested in that, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to not miss out on any one of my future videos. Other than that, let's just jump on into it. And the very first tip I have for you is you need to treat this not as a hobby, but as a business. So what I mean by this is regardless if this is your first property or your 10th property, you want to ensure that you're treating this as a business where you're not just flying by the seat of your pants and figuring it out as you go, but you're implementing systems and processes to help streamline and find the right candidates for you. So some basic processes you should implement is make sure you have a standardized screening for tenants and you understand exactly what the flow is from going from a possible tenant all the way to renting your property and what check marks they need to hit along the way. Another process you would want to implement is understanding and making sure you're tracking all your finances and you're keeping a log of all the receipts. So when tax time does come, you can still take advantage of all the tax benefits real estate has to offer you. So one final process you want to think about implementing is how you and the tenant are going to communicate once they're actually living in that property if any problems arise. So what is the tenant communication style like? Are you going to be sending them an email? Are they allowed to send you a text? Are they going to be sending it to you, or are they going to be sending it to someone else? And then once that problem does arise, let's say it's a plumbing issue, are you going to go out and try to fix it yourself first, or are you just going to have a third-party contractor go out and do that work for you? These are things you want to think about before purchasing your property. Now, the next tip I could give you is to make sure you have a high-quality property, as high-quality properties attract a higher quality tenant, and higher quality tenants are more likely to pay rent on time in full, just give you less of a headache and be able to manage that property with more care so there's less repairs when they move out. And typically, higher quality tenants are more likely to stay in that one property for longer periods of time, whereas someone that's looking for the cheapest rent out there might bounce around after their lease is up. So cheaper properties attract lower quality tenants that not only, just because it's a cheaper property, you're gonna have more repairs to do with it, but they could also be more likely not to pay rent on time or just be a bigger pain in your butt. And one of the best ways to find higher quality tenants, besides just having a higher quality place to rent out, is also just to attract more possible tenants, which is the next tip on this list here. As if you only have 2 people to apply to rent out your place, it's gonna be hard to ensure you get a quality tenant. And that's why you need to ensure you're marketing on a variety of different platforms. As at the end of the day, you remember, you're treating this as a business and not a hobby. And I don't know any businesses that only advertise on one channel. Instead, they advertise on a variety of channels, and that's exactly what you need to do. So ensure when you have a lease open, make sure you're doing everything possible to get the most amount of possible tenants through your system. So you could easily do this through adding a sign on your yard. It could be posting it on the natural MLS, just on Facebook or Kijiji Marketplace. It could be a newspaper ad. It could be a Facebook ad. It could be a local website that is particular to renters in that area. But regardless of what you do, make sure at the very minimum you have between 3 and 5 sources that you're using to help you rent out and find tenants for your place. So because of the marketing, you're gonna have a lot more tenants come through you. And like I mentioned before, you wanna make sure you have a proper tenant screening system put in place. And there's really 4 main areas you wanna look into. The first being is you wanna make sure that they have an income that can support your rent. And typically what you wanna look for is an income that is 2 to 3 times higher than the rent you are charging. And not just any income, but you also wanna make sure that they have at least a stable job where they're getting a reliable source of that income from. So another thing you want to check is their credit history, because at the end of the day, you want your tenants to pay your bills on time and in full. So this is a great indication of how good they are with their money and how reliable they are on paying their bills on time. So ideally, you want to find a client that has a credit score of above 600. Then another thing you want to check is also their rental history. So at the end of the day, if a tenant was a great tenant in a past property, they're most likely going to be a great tenant for you. However, if they were problems or they got an eviction in their past properties, that could be an absolute red flag that you don't want to rent your place to them. And one pro tip I always recommend my clients do if you're showing your property in person is to walk that tenant to their car and check out how they treat their car, as it's a great indication of how they're going to treat your place. Because at the end of the day, if their car's messy, they're most likely going to be living in a messy place, and you don't want your place to be treated with a bunch of trash and litter all over the ground. Instead, you want to find someone that has a clean car that's going to take good care of your property. Now, the fifth thing you can do is to make sure you have clear communication between you and your tenant, because at the end of the day, you are both not mind readers, so you need to make sure you have an open dialogue with each other. And as you, the landlord, there's a couple great things you can do to lay the groundwork to ensure this open dialogue. And the first is to make clear expectations of who the tenant is actually going to reach out to if they do have a problem, and on what medium, whether that's a phone call, text, or email, and then what time of the day is the standard communication time unless it's an emergency. So it could be a typical 9 to 5, or maybe it's 7 to 7 p.m. or something along those lines. And then the final thing you want to make sure that you both are on the same page for is what the length of time is for you guys to get back to each other. Now this will ensure you guys are on the same page, because at the end of the day, the biggest reason for complaints between tenants and landlords is a lack of communication. So it's a great way to lay the groundwork. So when you are communicating with your tenant, make sure you're keeping a clear and detailed record so that if something does arise in the future, you can set the record straight of exactly what you communicated between each other. So make sure you're logging if they have any questions, what your solutions or your responses were to them, if there's any problems, when they were also resolved, as well as if rent was paid on time or in full. This record will definitely help you save your butt if you ever need to use it in the future. And I always recommend for any landlord to check in with their tenants on a minimum at least every 3 months to make sure everything is working well. As when you check in on a regular basis with the tenants, not only is it going to show you care and that you're treating this as a business and that you want to make them a long-term customer, as the best possible thing you can have is a tenant that's going to stay there for multiple years, where you don't have to worry about finding new tenants and if the new tenants are going to pay or keep the property in a well-kept manner. And not only that, but you'll also learn about any maintenance or repairs that might need to be done that they didn't want to bother you about, but if those are left untreated, could cost a lot more money down the road if they were not treated today. Which brings me on to my next tip here, which is to ensure that you're staying on top of all maintenance and repairs. As the number one complaint I hear about people that don't want to manage rental properties is that they don't want to be having to fix a toilet at 2 a.m. And there's really 2 ways you can help minimize any of these unexpected repairs. One is a house is just like a car. You bring your car in for regular service checkups, so make sure that you have a regular scheduled time, at least every 6 months, maybe to a year, that you're going into the property, making sure everything is in good working order and repairing any of those little things that you might have noticed. And two is to make sure you have systems and processes put in place to deal with emergency repairs, as emergencies do happen. So you want to make sure you know exactly how you're going to deal with it rather than have to figure out exactly when that emergency is happening. So make sure you have a system to put in place and you have contacts you can reach out to help you with those repairs. And if you're managing multiple properties, it's great to build up a network of plumbers, electricians, HVAC people, and more to help you out managing your property. As at the end of the day, you might be a handyman, but you're not going to know as much as these experts are going to know about those particular subjects. And it also gives you an easy way to outsource those problems so you're you're not gonna have to deal with that toilet at 2 a.m. Now, the next tip I could highly recommend you look into is to understand fair housing laws. So this will allow you to better understand exactly your screening process and who you can say no to for particular reasons and who you can't say no to, or for that matter, even ask those questions around. So if someone has a prior eviction or a smoker or maybe 10 cats, you can say no to those people for a certain reason. However, you cannot discriminate against people based on their race, religion, their sexual orientation, their disability, or their family status. So when you're screening tenants, you don't want to ask any of this information here, as the last thing you want to do is be on the hook for discriminating against some tenants, and if you're found guilty, you could have to end up paying some massive fines. Now, remember, this is a business and all businesses have to work under the laws, so you want to make sure your operations are lawfully. Now, the next tip I could recommend for you is to make sure you have a rock solid lease. So to have a rock solid lease, make sure you're not discriminating, but make sure your lease stipulates everything that's going to be. So what they can expect when they're moving in, what they can expect when they're moving out, what happens when they move out, if there's garbage, are you going to be applying a cleaning fee towards them? So that you want to have this rock solid lease so that if anything does happen where that tenant is breaking that lease, you can possibly have the option of bringing them to small claims court so you can recuperate the money that they owe you. Now, what's great is that Ontario has actually come out and given a standard lease form for all landlords to use, so you don't have to go about having to try and create a legally binding lease yourself. You can just use the Ontario lease and then from there modify it for your own particular use. So if you want to get access to an Ontario lease, just drop a comment below and I can send you a link so you can get easy access to the leases that are available in Ontario. And the final tip I can recommend you to ensure you're managing your properties effectively is to actually make sure that you enforce that lease. So on your lease, you're gonna have some rules and guidelines for both moving in and out that you and the tenant have agreed to. And you wanna make sure you stick to those guidelines and any repercussions that are associated with breaking those guidelines. Because at the end of the day, if you start to bend backwards or break rules you set out in your lease, the tenant is going to start to see that and start to bend and break rules on their own. And the most common way I see too many landlords do this is bending backwards with rent. As at the end of the day, a tenant might come to you and say, hey, I'm gonna be a week late with paying rent. Now, I would recommend you go back to your lease and go, hey, well, this is what we agreed to if the rent is going to be paid a week late. Because at the end of the day, if you start to bend and break rules, the tenant's gonna see that and then they're gonna think it's all right to break or bend rules. And this is where the snowball really happens for a lot of landlords that eventually end in eviction, as that tenant that once was a week late then becomes 2 weeks late and then becomes a month late, and then eventually it's 3 months gone by and they've still never paid their rent. Now, this is absolutely the worst possible scenario where now you're having to deal with an eviction and getting them out of your unit. So make sure that your tenant understands that if they're going to break a rule or guidelines that you guys have agreed to, that there's repercussions set in place in your contract with them. So I'm not saying to be unreasonable, because at the end of the day, when you both signed the lease, you both thought it was fair at that moment. I'm just saying to uphold the lease that you've both agreed to. Now, those are the 9 tips I have found so far through my experience and my education to help us better manage our rental properties. So if you've enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like button, as it really does help me out with the YouTube algorithm. And if you're interested in learning more about real estate, finance, or personal development, make sure to hit the subscribe button and the notification bell to not miss out on any one of our future videos. And if you're looking to purchase your very first rental property, the strategy I always recommend to any one of my clients is house hacking. So if you want to learn more about that, you can find it right there. Other than that, guys, I hope you have a great and successful week, and I'll talk to you next week.